Chapter 1, Lesson 8 of Geometry, looking at the coordinate plane and determining lengths in the coordinate plane. We looked at the distance formula in the last video, determining the length or the distance between 2 points in the coordinate plane using the distance formula. In this video, we want to look at how do we determine the coordinates of the midpoint of a segment that's in the coordinate plane. So we have this formula here, and you can read this. Basically what it comes down to is this. We have 2 endpoints. Every segment does. Now those endpoints have a coordinate x and y. We talked about that in the last video. So how do you determine the midpoint? The midpoint is also going to have an x and a y associated with it. So we're going to have to determine the x and the y, and we can't do it together, so basically we're going to do it separately. And so we have this midpoint formula. You have this little equation on the left, x sub 1 plus x sub 2 divided by 2. That will give you the x coordinate of the midpoint. And then you have this other little formula, y sub 1 plus y sub 2 divided by 2 gives you the y coordinate of the midpoint. The main thing to remember about this is because we're dealing with the coordinate plane, whoops, I don't know why that came up. Because we're dealing with the coordinate plane, every point has 2 parts to it, the x coordinate part and the y. So the midpoint formula is actually 2 formulas in one. One to help you determine the x value of the midpoint, and the second one to help you figure out the y value of the midpoint. Now each one of these x's is the x coordinate of each endpoint, and these y's are the y coordinates of each endpoint, and then you add them, divide by 2, that will give you the coordinate of the midpoint. So here's an example where we're asked to determine the midpoint of QS. Now you'll notice we need to know the coordinates of Q and the coordinates of S. They're not here, so we'll have to determine them for ourselves. So looking at the scale, each line is worth 2. We can determine these coordinates of going over 3, 5 for Q, and then 7, negative 9 for S. Now that we know the coordinates, it's simply a matter of substituting them into the formula. So the x coordinate of the midpoint, I just wrote this as this way. You take the 2 x values of the endpoints, add them together, and divide by 2. So 7 plus 3 divided by 2 is equal to 5. Then you take the 2 y coordinates, substitute them in, add together, and divide by 2. So this is the x coordinate, and this is the y coordinate. So you put them in an ordered pair as your final answer. So the midpoint is at 5, negative 2. And we can kind of confirm that if we go over 2, 4, 5, and down 2. So right here would be the midpoint of this second segment. So it's simply a matter of substituting the values into this little expression. Now one little kind of twist to this is a problem like this, where they tell us the midpoint is 5, negative 8, and one of the endpoints is negative 2, 8. The midpoint's given, so we have to determine the coordinate of the missing endpoint. So what that looks like, if we just kind of mentally get a picture of this, we have this, let's see, where can I do this? Let's do it right here. We have a midpoint is at 5, negative 8. So right here at 5, negative 8, now that's the midpoint. An endpoint is at negative 2, 8. So now this is the endpoint. This is up here at negative 2, 8. So now this is halfway between, and so there's another half of the segment over here, and what we want to know is what is this endpoint here. Okay, so that's what we're trying to figure out, is what is the endpoint. Now this is a little bit different than what we've been using the midpoint formula for, is because here we know x1 and x2, and we're trying to figure out xm. And in this situation, we know xm and we don't know one of these two. And it's really no different than what you would do or what we've been doing with these. We substitute in the values that we know, and then we solve the equation for what we don't know. So if I take these values and substitute them in, I know that the midpoint x coordinate is 5. I know that one of the x coordinates is negative 2, and what I want to know is this other x coordinate here. So I substitute those values in here, and I have this equation. Now in order to solve this equation, I need to take care of this 2 in the denominator, so I'll multiply both sides by 2. So multiplying this by 2 gives me 10, multiplying this side by 2 reduces that 2. Okay, so let me just kind of write this down. So if I multiply this by 2, and then I multiply this by 2. Okay, so these 2's reduce to 1, that's why this is left, and then 2 times 5 is 10. So I get the x-coordinate here is 12. So now I need to find the y-coordinate, so I do the same thing again, only this time I do it with the y's. So I substitute in the y value of the midpoint, which I know, and then I substitute in a y value that I know, and then I have one y value that I don't know, and then I simply solve this equation. So multiplying both sides by 2 eliminates the 2 in the denominator, and solve this. So my coordinate then of my endpoint is 12, negative 24. So you can use this to figure out the endpoint, or you can use it to figure out the midpoint. It doesn't matter. It's simply algebraically substituting in and then simplifying the expression. So let me do one more example for you so you kind of get this. So here we have the midpoint is negative 5, the midpoint is 5, negative 8, and again I'm just going to sketch a picture out here. 5, negative 8 would be somewhere down here. One endpoint is at 0, 4. So this is 0, 4, this is the midpoint, and what I want to know is what is this x down here and what is this y? And I know that this is at 5, negative 8. So I'm going to use my formula. The midpoint is 5, the x, and I know one of the endpoints is 0, plus the other one, whatever it is, and divided by 2. So then I'm going to multiply both sides by 2, because that's going to make that reduce. So that's going to give me 10 is equal to 0 plus x, so x is equal to 10. So the coordinate down here is 10, and now I need to do the same thing using y. So the y of the midpoint is negative 8, and that's one endpoint, y, plus the other endpoint, which I don't know, divided by 2. So again, I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. Negative 16, that reduces. 4 plus y, solve for y, y is negative 20. So this would be negative 20. So the other endpoint is negative 20. This endpoint is 0, 4. That will give me a midpoint of 5, negative 8.